building off the last section, I think it's in some respects understandable that many young radicalizing people look to Stalinism and Marxist-Leninism. It's presented as a revolutionary alternative to US imperialism and social democratic reformism. According to common left-wing knowledge, it is successful revolutions under its belt. And unlike common reformism, it actually looks to some of the most oppressed sections of the globe, the third world. But Marxism does not take anything at face value. We don't accept that the US, quote unquote, fights for freedom and democracy just because it says so. We examine social relations in motion and uncover the truth behind the phrases. Just because a party or society says it's fighting for socialism doesn't mean it's true. Marxism is also not a politics of individual morality. Stalinist agents and bureaucratic rulers were certainly capable of astonishing violence and appalling violations of revolutionary socialism, but that does not explain why they did what they did. In short, in their efforts of national development or socialism in one country, these bureaucracies have carried out policies that protected their own narrow class interests. Their actions and ideological justifications corresponded to their position in the class relations of their societies and an interaction with forces beyond their national borders. And the results were reactionary and against the cause for socialism. Doug covered much about Stalinism in the USSR already, but before I move forward, I do want to review. As he said, Stalin with his socialism in one country as much reflected the emerging class of bureaucrats as it reflected his own individual ambitions. As Isaac Ducher said, this vision of socialism in one country, quote, took possession of him, but it did so because it corresponded to the things that were latent in so many other minds. And we should also add in their fears. At the heart of this vision was industrialization, capital accumulation in order to outcompete the West and stabilize the bureaucracy's rule. In his 1926 follow-up book Problems of Leninism, Stalin makes clear what this socialism in one country is all about. As Marx said, quote, paraphrased earlier, quote, to slacken the pace of industrialization would mean to lag behind, and those who lag behind are beaten. We do not want to be beaten. We are 50 or 100 years behind the advanced countries. We must make good this lag in 10 years. Either we do it or they crush us. But who made good this lag? The working class and peasantry through their brutal exploitation at the hands of, what I would argue, state capitalist bureaucrats. By 1928, the bureaucracy had established its footing and took off with this form of accumulation. It was here that Stalin launched the first of several 5-year plans. This meant a total reorganization of labor and society. At the beginning of the revolution, workers directly decided on production through workplace committees, later alongside party cells to direct each factory's technical manager. A December 1917 declaration of the Central Council of Factory Committees reads, quote, workers' control of industry as an integral part of control over the whole of economic life must be understood not in the narrow sense of simple inspection, but on the contrary, in the broad sense of intervening in the employer's disposal of capital, stocks, raw materials, and finished goods in the factory, not stopping short of active measures to restrain employers. Control must be seen precisely as a transitional step towards the whole economic life of the country on social lines, as the first step in this direction taken from below, parallel with work at the top of in the central organs of the economy. Contrast this to a September 1929 declaration by the Communist Party Central Committee. It resolved that workers' committees, quote, may not intervene directly in the running of the plant or endeavor in any way to replace plant administration. While the technical manager at first worked at the behest of the factory committee and party cell, by 1935, a state textbook on Soviet economic law stated, quote, OneMan Management is the most important principle of the organization of socialist economy. And that's far from all. Let's look at a few other examples. Article 37 of the Soviet Labor Code of 1922 established that changing jobs was at the consent of the worker. As late as 1930, the small Soviet encyclopedia stated, quote, the custom of internal passports instituted by the autocracy as an instrument of police oppression of the toiling masses was suppressed by the October Revolution. Starting in 1931, though, an internal passport system and labor book were reintroduced. At first, no worker was allowed to leave Leningrad without special permission, and this was then extended to all of Russia. The labor book recorded a worker's employment history and was presented to the enterprise director when trying to get a job. In Victor Serge's words, quote, "With each change of employ, the reason for the change is entered into the passport. I have known workers discharged for not having come on the day of rest to contribute a, quote, voluntary and naturally gratuitous day of work, in whose passports is written, quote, discharged for sabotage of the production plan." And this is for the relatively, quote unquote, privileged workers in official industry. Accumulation also took place through an explosion in forced prison labor. A former GPU official states that in 1930, the total number of prisoners in the entire network of work camps was just over 660,000. By 1938, one escaped prisoner estimated that 5 to 6 million people were imprisoned. In the detailed map and list of 35 labor camps he provided, each camp was geared to a different form of labor: mining, hydropower, railroad construction, textiles, etc. By 1941, gross output for all enterprises managed by the secret police, the NKVD, was planned to be 1.97 billion rubles at 1926 prices, an increase of more than 500 times that of the 1925 output for convict labor. And just as discipline was reintroduced into the factory, so it was for the rest of society. The nuclear family, the gender binary, and heteronormativity, we must remember, are central to capitalism's reproduction of labor. With the revolution, easy divorce and abortion were legalized. Homosexuality was decriminalized and queer marriage was legalized. By 1926, it became legal to change your sex on passports. The state funded research on trans, queer, and intersex issues, and permission was granted to perform gender reassignment surgeries. All this changed with the rise of Stalinism, which sought to reintroduce social reproduction in the form of the family. Progressive laws were retracted, abortion was banned in 1936, homosexuality was criminalized again. These shifts could only take place with the liquidation of the old Bolshevik revolutionary leaders. In 1934, 80% of that year's Communist Party Congress had joined before 1921. Of those 1,900 delegates, 1,100 were arrested in the years following. Of the 139 members and candidates for the party's Central Committee elected at that Congress, 70% were arrested and shot. This counter-revolution on every level had its intended effect. By the second 5-year plan, steel and rolled steel met or exceeded the planned production outputs. By the fourth 5-year plan, coal, oil, electricity, pig iron, steel, and rolled steel all exceeded their production outputs. In place of production for consumption, as in the early years of the revolution, production for capital accumulation, particularly for heavy industry, reigned supreme. In 1927 to 28, the gross output for the means of consumption, means of producing consumer goods, was 67% of total industrial output, while those means of production for heavy industry was 33% of total output. By 1937, that was flipped. 58% went to the means of production for every industry, while only 42% went to means of consumption. Brezhnev, the Soviet premier that succeeded Khrushchev, who had previously succeeded Stalin, made clear the motivation and strategy of this bureaucracy. Competition for the West drove capital accumulation. He was quoted in Pravda in 1970 as stating, quote, "This competition with the West takes different forms. In many cases, we are coping successfully with the task of overtaking and outdistancing the capitalist countries in the production of certain types of output. But the fundamental question is not only how much you produce, but at what cost, with what outlays of labor. In this field, the center of gravity between the systems lies in our time." As Stalinism emerged in Russia, it began corrupting the entire international communist movement. We talked a little bit about this in the last section. This meant not only making military alliances, but also tamping down on the potentially destabilizing winds of revolution. How did this happen? Stalinism used the revolutionary credentials of the Bolsheviks against the newly minted communist parties elsewhere. As Chinese communist Zhang Xiaolin said about the 1925 Chinese Communist Party resolution condemning Trotsky, quote, on theoretical and political questions, the Chinese Communist Party Congress simply accepted Comintern instructions. Because of the issues at stake within the CPSU, the Communist Party of the Soviet Union, had already become public and had spread to the Comintern, communist parties in the various countries were formally passing anti-Trotskyist resolutions to send to Moscow. And of course, the Chinese communists had to be among them, even though, as I have said, few of us knew what the controversy was about. The result was that the resolution passed unanimously. As time went on, the Russian leadership of the Comintern directly intervened and would purge, quote unquote, disobedient leaders of foreign parties. Reading the history of the American Communist Party, one can clearly see the jockeying for favor between the factions of Pepper and Lovestone, William Z. Foster, and James Buchanan. And around this time, there was this old joke among American communists. How are the Communist Party of America and the Brooklyn Bridge similar? The answer, they're both held together by cables. Cables as in telegrams from Russia, if you get my drift. And this had disastrous effects on struggles for liberation and socialism around the world. Let's talk about China. In China, throughout the 1920s, the communists organized workers for both national liberation from colonialism and for socialist liberation from capitalism. By 1926, its party membership had reached 58,000 members. Yet the rising Russian bureaucracy had made an alliance with the bourgeois nationalist Kuomintang, the KMT, arms and training from Russia and hope in a nationalist revolution against world imperialism. They discounted the possibility of workers' revolution in spite of the 3.5 million Chinese workers working in foreign-owned factories and the 11 million working in smaller workplaces. A mistaken political perspective is one thing, but when facts on the ground changed, the bureaucracy stuck to its alliance. Workers did rise up, launching general strikes and a government number 2 that shared many similarities to the Paris Commune in Guangzhou. The Kuomintang, as a party representing capitalists, responded by massacring workers and communist activists alike. The Comintern silenced all criticism of the Kuomintang, ordering the Chinese communists to remain loyal to the KMT. Stalin's chief emissary in China, Borodin, summed it up, quote, the present period is one in which the communists should do coolie service for the Kuomintang. As a result, the Communist Party of China lost 4/5 of its membership, and with the bloody repression of workers' revolution, it was forced to retreat to the rural hinterlands in a few short years afterwards. And I just wanted to, before I move on, I have a section talking about Germany. I did want to also highlight just how fucking craven the Comintern was in regards to its third period policies. Not only did the communists refuse to call for joint action with the reformist socialists in fighting fascism, these communists both fought and allied with the Nazis. When the Nazis led a referendum campaign in 1931 to overthrow the social democratic government in Prussia, the German communists joined them under, the quote unquote red referendum. As Donnie Gluckstein writes, quote, at first, the German Communist KPD Politburo voted unanimously against participation. Then, Stalin and Molotov weighed in and forced the KPD to reconsider. Soon after, the party threw its efforts into the campaign and working alongside the Nazis and claiming that a big vote would be, quote, be a great victory against fascism. Remember this when a Stalinist upholds Russia's supposed anti-fascist credentials. Let's talk about Cuba. The Popular Front that Doug described had its own pernicious effect on the Third World. This meant allying again with allegedly quote unquote progressive sections of the bourgeoisie in various countries. In 1933, the Cuban working class toppled dictator Gerardo Machado in an uprising. He was replaced first by a progressive Grau San Martin, who was then overthrown in a military coup by Batista. After a failed general strike in 1935 against Batista, his regime murdered hundreds of working class militants and declared war on the Cuban Communist Party. But following the Comintern line of unity with progressive forces, the CCP ended up entering an alliance with Batista. Two communists joined Batista's cabinet and another took control of the state-controlled Labor Federation. The CCP supported Batista and Batista's candidates in the elections. This, understandably, completely destroyed any communist credibility, helping to further atomize a working class and giving away to middle-class nationalist forces. Let's move to Vietnam. This tendency for alliances continued as the USSR allied with Britain, France, and the US during World War II. In practical terms, this meant squelching national liberation and socialist movements in colonies these nations owned. In Vietnam, a French colony at the time, Ho Chi Minh stated the aims of the Stalinist Communist Party during this period in his quote, in his party's line in the period of the Democratic Front from July 1939. Quote, one, for the time being, the party cannot put forward too high a demand, national independence, parliament, etc. To do this is to enter the Japanese fascist scheme. It should only claim for democratic rights. To reach this goal, the party must strive to organize a broad democratic national front. This front does not embrace only Indo-Chinese people, but also progressive French residing in Indochina, not only toiling people, but also the national bourgeoisie. 3, the party must assume a wise and flexible attitude with the bourgeoisie, strive to draw it into the front, win over elements that can be won over, and neutralize those which can be neutralized. We must by all means avoid leaving them outside the front, lest they should fall into the hands of the enemy of the revolution and increase the strength of the reactionaries. After the Japanese fell to the Allied forces, Vietnamese nationalists under the Communist Party declared an independent Democratic Republic of Vietnam. But the Russian Stalinists had signed an agreement with Western imperialists in Yalta and Potsdam that Indochina belonged to the Western zone of influence. The USSR did not give diplomatic recognition to the Democratic Republic of Vietnam until 4 years after its declaration. Let's move to Palestine. As the 1940s rolled on, the USSR sought to expand its network of client states, just as other imperialisms did. The most heinous of this work was the key role it played in the formation of Israel and the theft of Palestine. In 1946, a representative of the Jewish agency, a key Zionist colonial organization, wrote to another representative regarding their aims for colonization. Quote, not only is there no reason to expect Russian policy to be hostile to us, there are grounds for thinking it will be friendly, not out of sympathy to us or out of hatred towards the Arabs, but in order to settle political accounts with England. These political accounts were over control of the Middle East and Russia's position in it. While as late as March 1947, the USSR advocated for a single independent and democratic Palestine, whose citizens would enjoy equal national and democratic rights, that position quickly changed. I'm just going to quote at length an article on the matter. Quote, on the 28th of April, 1947, the day in which the special session of the UN General Assembly convened, Ambassador Gromyko received a new directive which entirely reversed the earlier one. He was suddenly asked to change the line and emphasize the, quote, unparalleled disaster and suffering inflicted on the Jewish people during the war. This was merely a prelude to a dramatic change in the Soviet attitudes towards the solution on the ground. While the urge to terminate the British mandate remained an axis on which the Soviet policy rotated, the ambassador was instructed to, quote, consider various projects for meeting Jewish needs. A subsequent telegram from Molotov explained that the first proposal of a dual state was merely motivated by, quote, tactical considerations. Molotov wished to avoid the inevitable impression that Russia was now taking the initiative in the creation of a Jewish state, though that option, as he explained, quote, better conveys our position. The implementation of the original agenda would not only have dealt a death blow to Jewish aspirations, but would have changed entirely the history of the Middle East. The Jewish agency, unaware of the catastrophe it avoided, took credit for the change, attributing it to their meticulous preparatory work. But to the delegates in the United States, it was obvious that the change was a result of, quote, coincidence of interest and attitude. In Stalin's impressive arsenal of realpolitik maneuvers, placing Russian interests above all, support of the Jewish state was neither the first nor the last marriage of convenience. The end of World War II also meant the beginning of the end of Europe's direct colonial empires. The Cold War ushered in a wave of victories for national liberation movements. With state power in their hands, many of these nationalists modeled themselves on Stalin's quest to, quote, catch up to the West, to pursue the creation of a state that could compete on the world stage with other imperial powers. Instead, these ex-national liberation leaders sought to develop their economies and de-link themselves from world capitalism. As Kwame Nkrumah, future president of Ghana, stated, quote, government interference in all matters affecting economic growth in less developed countries is today a universally accepted principle. It's understandable why. Colonialism had absolutely deformed these nations. For example, Cuba's refined commodities were limited by US import policies and laws. At maximum, 22% of Cuban sugar exported to its main trade partner could be refined sugar. This in turn held back Cuba's development of factories and mechanization. But that doesn't mean what they replaced colonialism with was socialism. Like state capitalism, Russia, what I would argue state capitalism, their states subordinated the interests of workers and peasants to accumulation. Secondly, even this autonomous development was continually frustrated by the realities of the interconnected and unequal imperial stage of capitalism. Now let's talk about accumulation. When we think about accumulation and subordination, one only needs to quote the Zimbabwe Congress of Trade Unions set up by Robert Mugabe, the Robert Mugabe government post-liberation and stacked with his loyalists. Quote, this country needs a disciplined workforce to encourage development, and we are not going to achieve anything by going on strike, no matter how genuine our grievance. Striking workers were arrested, beaten, and detained by riot police under the very same colonial laws used to contain rising Black working class and nationalist militancy. Compare that statement to one from one of the principal union leaders in the USSR who declared in 1933, quote, the proper determination of wages and the regulation of labor demand that the industrial heads and the technical directors be charged with immediate responsibility in this matter. This is also dictated by the necessity of establishing a single authority and ensuring economy in the management of enterprises. They, the workers, must not defend themselves against their government. Delinking was another sort of attempt as part of this. Delinking is similarly reformist and unrealistic as the creation of any small commune that utopian socialists attempted before Marx. The imperial era of capitalism means that the world is completely divided. Monopolies and imperial powers spread across the whole world. To suggest it's possible to separate oneself off and sort of remove oneself from the vagaries of the market means that imperialism doesn't actually need to be overthrown through international revolution, but merely avoided through state policy. This was shown in Cuba, where in trying to free itself from one form of imperialism, the US, it became dependent on another, the USSR. A 1963 agreement between the USSR and Cuba established a 5 million tons per year quota for sugar exports, paid only in non-convertible currency that could only be used inside the Russian bloc countries. As before, these and other agreements helped to ensure that sugar production remained a dominant element of the Cuban economy, and it frustrated attempts to industrialize. Even to this day, Cuba relies on larger powers for support. Not sure if folks saw in the past week, but Cuba signed an agreement with China to continue housing a spy base on the island in exchange for billions of dollars of aid. Likewise, even the satellite states were far from equal partners with the USSR. In splitting from Russia's control, Yugoslavia stated, quote, Russia's revolutionary phraseology conceals counter-revolutionary attempts to prevent industrialization of our country. China similarly complained, quote, "The prices of many goods we imported from the Soviet Union were much higher than those on the world market." In fact, the inequality of world capitalism cannot be solved by either one side or the other or another, between its centers or its peripheries. Rather than seeing the center of revolution in peripheral state capitalism, rather than seeing the center of revolution in either solely in movements against a limited colonialism or in a form of socialist imperialism, revolutionary internationalists see the inseparable link between building a movement here and connecting with revolutionary working class forces elsewhere. I want to sum up by stating that this is not just an abstract or curious piece of history. These ideas inform political movements today. Take Marianela Prada Tejada, executive of the Ministry of Finance cabinet in the Evo Morales government. In 2013, she stated, "The development strategy of the Morales government was to, quote, take advantage of the possibility of growth through the exploitation of natural resources, with the state capturing the surplus and redistributing it to social programs and to other economic sectors that generate employment." There are few assumptions grounding Stalinism and Marxist-Leninism today, holdovers from years gone by. The first, with state capitalism spreading to every corner of the developing world, with Russia's own imperialism and the Cold War between it and the US, quote unquote, communism was identified as one's allegiances in the world order. This has meant today that even the most brutal dictators are seen as saints, and the most popular uprisings are seen as devils solely based on their position in the global order. This is a disaster for building a truly international revolutionary movement. Second assumption is that colonies, semi-colonies, and former colonies did not and do not have a developed enough working class to make a workers' revolution. Instead, these Marxist-Leninists and Stalinists look to other classes or other forms of revolution, whether they look to a guerrilla army, or when we talk about other forms of revolution, they look to bourgeois democratic stages. First, the bourgeois democratic stage, and then maybe in the future we'll get to the socialism. This is the importance and validity of Trotsky's theory of permanent revolution, that these nations suffering under the boot of imperialism do actually indeed have agency. Though their working classes are small, they have an outsized weight to lead other classes to overturn not only imperialism, but capitalism as well. Colonialism, as I said before, certainly deformed and undermined economic development, but it did so unevenly. In the sort of immediate era after World War II, African working classes actually played a key role in Nigeria and elsewhere in fomenting the nationalist movements through their strikes and struggles. Today, we face rising rivalries between China and the US, the quest for profit, resources, and power that's driving climate change, and how we know workers and all the self-altering classes in all countries will suffer from war and imperialist domination. We live in a world today where Stalinism can't answer these questions. We must expose the lie. Stalinism and Marxist-Leninism will gladly sacrifice these classes in a distorted allegiance to the enemy of my enemy. We must show ourselves to be the greatest champions of international revolution that we are. We are the ones who carry the banner. After all, workers of the world unite.